So here to talk about a slightly different take on DevOps and how we might be able to take some of those principles and apply it to an adjacent discipline, compliance. So by way of background, how many of you have worked in or served in a nuclear security or national security program? Right, so several. So spent. Say again.
Who's willing to admit it?
Yeah, that's also true. That's also true. So I spent 10 years at Los Alamos National Lab, built their cloud and collaboration platforms, and felt this pain around compliance and having to build all this documentation for these systems, and thought, well, there's got to be some ways to think about this in a different way. So as Matt mentioned, thank you for the opportunity to come here and talk about some of this new concept here. Really done quite a bit of work around at the Cloud Security Alliance around how to think about this a different way. So with that, we'll kind of talk a little bit about, why is compliance so hard? How many of you have to deal with compliance in any way, shape, or form? All right, so we've got definitely a couple folks here, at least half have to deal with compliance. So, it's this manual paper-based usually activity that you have to do, right? And as you're trying to transform, we had a conversation around transformation, right? How do you transform your organization? This compliance piece is typically a bottleneck to that transformation journey, right? So when you decompose that into kind of different roles and responsibilities, internal audit, you've got to gather all this evidence, right? It's this mountain that's really difficult to climb. It's largely manual. It's largely paper-based. You've got different audits that come to you for different regulations. And if you're not compliant, you either get fined or, government even worse. You could have misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and folks stealing your data. And then, as soon as you make this, across the geographies, it's got different regulations and different geographies. You've got different systems of record. And this is what a lot of orgs feel like the day after an audit is scheduled, right? People are running all over the place, trying to find the latest compliance docs, seeing when they were last updated, seeing if they match systems as implemented. Sound about right? Yes, no, maybe? I see a couple nodding heads. So let's kind of, again, decompose this problem a bit further. So, a lot of these docs are stored in Word docs and Excel spreadsheets, stored in file servers, managed with processes. And then as you have to go gather the evidence, they're all stored in these systems, right? Your vulnerability scanning tools, your cloud security posture management tools. And then when you find an issue, you got to open up a ticket in ServiceNow or Jira, or shooting emails back and forth, right? For multitudes of standards and frameworks, NIST, ISO, PCI, SOC, so on and so forth. And then you got to do that across multiple systems and applications and multiple business units and multiple geographies. This is a pretty challenging problem at scale, right? And it's largely manual. So, one of the things that I'd like to posit is there a better way? Is there a different way to think about this? And we're in a standards conference, right? In a different discipline where we can think about DevOps and applying those concepts to compliance. So saw a definition of DevOps, right? Several different definitions of DevOps. I do not have the figure 8 chart, so sorry. It's hard to disappoint.
Get off the stage.
Yeah, it's got to leave. Sorry, no figure 8 chart. So sorry, just words. But with that, here's the AWS definition of DevOps, right? Obviously, everyone's got a different definition of DevOps. There's how many did you say there were out there? Millions of definitions, right? So here's the AWS definition. I'm not going to read it, but really at a high level, it's a combination of cultural philosophies and tools to allow organizations to deliver applications and services at a high pace, right? But it's an evolution and it's employing automation. So the idea here is how do you take, and build off a definition and apply that again to compliance. So I'm gonna actually put forward a proposed definition for RegOps, right? You can pick it apart, but at least it's a starting point for a conversation. Built kind of off that same point. So it's really a combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools, increasing our organization's ability to ensure compliance of applications against regulatory standards at high velocity. As opposed to a point-in-time activity, could you make compliance a real-time activity, right? And evolving compliance and trust faster than organizations doing it in a very traditional manual paper-based way. So this is a proposed definition of RegOps, right? And we're at a standards body, so obviously we can have a conversation around it. But I think there's got to be some key principles that you got to take to a couple with a proposed definition. So how many are familiar with the Agile Manifesto? Yeah, lots of hands. All right, so the Agile Manifesto has some guiding principles around how to do Agile. Well, how about a compliance manifesto that mirrors the Agile Manifesto, right? So here's some kind of core principles to think of in a compliance manifesto mirrored against an Agile Manifesto. One, regulations exist to maintain our privacy while keeping us safe and secure, right? Regulators didn't create regulations just because they felt like it was a good idea and, let's just make everyone's life more difficult, right? They're meant to provide guardrails in which to operate. Without regulations, you can do anything. Without standards, you can do anything, and bad things can happen, right? So they're more created for a good reason and good intent. How we demonstrate compliance against those regulations is a different story. But creating the regulations in the first place, they were designed for a good reason, right? Now, let's talk about maintaining compliance, right? Maintaining compliance should be affordable, it should be transparent, and it should be easy. It's not any of those things right now. But it should be those things if you're thinking about bringing the principles of DevOps to compliance, right? Number 3, if you have to do something more than once or twice or 10 times, if it's repetitive, you should automate it, right? It's good for the business, it's good for the regulator, it's good for the employee, it's good for everyone. This is where we can employ automation, again, to compliance. 4, when an audit actually happens, you should actually drive down the time and cost it takes to do an audit. It should be simpler. It should drive down risk, not increase risk, right? Every time the auditor walks in the door, it's usually the collective, everyone puts their head down and they're like, oh, here we go. You're going to have a bunch of questions, right? It's usually the auditors are not the ones you invite to your Christmas party, unfortunately. It just is what it is, right? But, if there is a transparent way in which to share information, maybe that tension wouldn't be so difficult, where it's more a collaborative exercise to demonstrate compliance. Number 5, evidence should be readily accessible, right? And collected in as near real time as possible. Right now, if you got to go answer questions to an audit, you got to go log into a bunch of systems, you got to go collect it, you got to go store it in some folder, you got to then go assemble evidence and go put it in a Word doc or an Excel spreadsheet. What if you can, back to number 3, automate those types of capabilities, right? Number 6, producing artifacts should be profitable for those that are producing it, and consuming the artifact should be cheaper for those that are getting it. So it drives mutually beneficial incentives. So instead of having to go, oh, look, I created this 600-page document to demonstrate compliance, if you can reuse elements of that and then make it cost effective for a consumer to get it, you're driving down costs for both sides. You're enabling reuse, right, which is a good thing, and you're enabling this process to go faster, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Number 7, technology will change over time, right? We just saw a wonderful eye chart of all the different tools that exist in the market. They will always change. There are tons of tools, right? So one thing that we know in our industry is there will always be change. There will always be new things. So anything that you employ has to be extensible to take advantage of all the new things that come out in the market, right? And minimize your tech debt moving in the future. Because if you don't want to build today's Ferrari to turn it into tomorrow's, Volkswagen, right? Now you got to go rebuild the whole thing. So number 8, getting started with compliance should be free. You shouldn't have to spend a lot of time and money and energy. You should have a way to do it for free, with the goal of pulling down those costs and driving your business forward or your organization forward. Number 9, build on industry compliance standards. We're at a standards body, right? So thus positing some of these thoughts, because we need industry standards here in this space, right? That's why I'm putting this out as a thought for a conversation, right? While accelerating adoption and ultimately do no harm, right? Because if you're not improving privacy, you're not improving safety, security, don't do it. So these are just some thoughts around kind of a way to think about compliance a different way, right? So, what are some of the ways that you can take advantage of technology trends to couple with this? So APIs. We now live in a world of APIs, where everything is connected to everything, right? So now by using modern APIs, we can pull and push information between systems, right, in ways that are more standardized. If you use REST, for example, as a way to communicate. DevOps, we just talked, we're at a DevSecOps, DevOps, right, industry standards day. So connect the APIs using DevOps techniques like Ansible playbooks to provide these low-cost bespoke integrations, right, based on whatever your own unique needs might be. CI/CD, right? Talk about CI/CD pipelines, right? DevOps day, right? So being able to use the tools that you have that can attest to your state of compliance in near real time, integrated in your CI/CD platform as new code is developed, your compliance documentation and your SBOMs are continuously being developed as well, right? You're not waiting until everything is done and then saying, okay, stop. Let me go do the compliance.
Let's go certify it.
Let me go certify it. Okay, everyone wait. Let me go certify it. Okay, now I certified it. Wait, how many revs do we have to go wait in the software because we were waiting to go certify this thing, right? Continuous delivery, continuous assurance, right? And then Internet of Things, right? So we have a way to now collect information from a variety of different sensors, right? So tie those to your compliance capabilities so you can consume them in your real time for physical systems and non-traditional systems. So that was a lot. Just thought I'd kind of put that out there for thought. So we'll kind of build on that and throw out some industry standards and frameworks. So I'm going to put two forward here and as for conversation. So we'll start with CSA and then we'll go to NIST. So CSA, how many are familiar with the cloud controls matrix? Okay, it's a couple hands here. So this is everything you see here is completely free. It's downloadable. You can get it from Cloud Security Alliance website or the NIST website. So I'll point you to those resources. So this is CSA's cloud controls matrix. This is a mapping framework of controls across multiple standards and frameworks. So there are multiple different mapping frameworks that exist today. This one's free. It was built by the community, right? So it's a paid framework. This is a free one. So I'm just putting that out there, right? But it allows you to say, okay, if I assess once against these CCM controls, I can use that assessment information across multiple standards and frameworks, right? So that's really the intent.
So can you give me, like, what is one of these controls?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of an eye chart, but risk-based planning assessment. So you have to develop how are you planning, for example, to do independent audits and assurances.
So like a checklist of things I need to be compliant to.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it maps to different controls, right? So like IA controls, for example, and in NIST, and then each standard tends to have something similar to that, right? So what the CCM does is it says, okay, these are the controls in these adjacent standards, and here are the deltas.
So here's the align.
Exactly. So it allows you to say, okay, here's a way to reuse that assessment information, because what ends up happening is you've got to build different packages for each one of these standards. But the base of the evidence that you collect is largely the same. So this allows you to normalize that across multiple. So this allows you to document everything in one place. So this comes with something called the Consensus Assessment Initiative Questionnaire, or CAKE. So these are the answers to the test. So instead of just saying, okay, here's the control, and trying to figure out how do I meet the control, it gives you a list of questions that you can ask to say, okay, what are the things that I need to do to reach that control? So for example, for that risk-based planning assessment, our independent audit and assurance assessments performed according to risk-based plans and policies as a question, right? So now you can answer that question, you collect the evidence saying this is how we do it, and you're no longer just looking at the control narrative and description saying, okay, how do I do this? Here are the questions to ask that go with that, right? And then it clarifies that shared responsibility model of who owns what, and then you can submit that to the CSA as a STAR registry. So there's a self-certification STAR level 1 that you can submit for cloud service providers. That's free. Okay, another standard. How many are familiar with NIST Open Security Controls Assessment Language? All right, we got one hand, a couple hands. All right, that's so I'll put another standard out here, another free standard, pages.nist.gov/OSCAL, OSCAL. This is the Open Security Controls Assessment Language. This is a collaboration between NIST and FedRAMP, right? This, basically think of this as kind of like a Rosetta Stone for compliance, where you can now have, and I'll break this down into its fundamental elements, a way to describe your compliance in a machine readable language, JSON and XML, and convert that back into Word and Excel. So output in both machine and human readable format using a standardized schema that applies across multiple standards and frameworks, right? So there's multiple layers. Think of this as kind of like a layer cake. So I'm going to walk through each layer of the cake and then kind of decompose it. But so basically from left to right, you start with your catalog of controls, NIST, CCM, ISO, whatever they might be, right? You then build a baseline of your documentation. So you say, okay, well, NIST has like low, moderate, high, or FedRAMP low, moderate, high. That's a subset of those controls. You then say, okay, here's how I'm going to implement those controls, or you take a custom baseline across multiple standards and frameworks. Then you build your system security plan, right? Which is, okay, this is how I meet those controls. Then you build your test plan, which is how am I going to go test those controls? And then you build your audit plan in like system assessment report, right? Or SAR, right? Of how am I going to assess these? These are all elements of one schema, and then you can output that as a single JSON file or an XML file, right? That ties back. So you can say, okay, here's the assessment that ties back to the test, that ties back to the control in the system security plan, that ties back to this control baseline, that ties back to this catalog, right? So there's this complete tie back all the way back, and you can then iterate on that and keep your package continuously up to date because you're outputting RegScale JSON as opposed to a 600-page Word doc that you got to stare and compare, right? Yet you can take that JSON and XML and convert it back into Word or XML. So let's talk about each individual layer. So what this does, this is a meta schema. So this meta schema normalizes the representation of a control across multiple types of standards and frameworks, right? Again, all open, free. This is on GitHub. So you can go to GitHub and you can go to NIST open source this. So it's a NIST open source standard. So it's a normalized way to represent a control catalog, right, across multiple control catalog implementations, right? It's designed to support multiple standards by default, right? So 853 is in there, but you can use it to create catalogs for CCM, for ISO IC, so on and so forth. But it's a normalized way to represent that, right? Then there's a normalized way to represent how you've established these baselines in RegScale, right? So this is referencing those underlying catalogs or those profiles, right? And it was really built between NIST and FedRAMP because, you know, FedRAMP is a pretty long, onerous, tedious process. It's very expensive, manual, paper-based process. So this was a way to accelerate FedRAMP's analysis of cloud service offerings by leveraging a machine-readable way to submit these packages, right? So, but this is the schema and standard in which to do that. So, what evidence that's out there right now is for NIST and FedRAMP low, moderate, high, SP 853, but it can be applied broadly across any standard or framework. Then you get to the system security plan. This is a normalized model for representing how you implement those controls for those individual components of the system. So there's a concept within RegScale of a component, which is a subset of a system, right? Think of it like a web app or a SQL server or whatnot, which is a component of a larger system. You can break that down in individual components in RegScale, declare them, and then say how your controls meet those components, or how the controls map to the components within the system of the overall architecture, right? So, so it is kind of this mapping framework. Then you define the models of how you're going to do the automated assessment of those controls, all right, and how you gather the evidence of those controls through standardized questions. So, all right. Again, I know that was a lot. So how do we bring all of this together? So we talked about RegScale, we talked about CCM, we talked about RegOps, right? How do you, kind of move from this manual paper-based world in which we live that's really challenging to scale, right? And take this big push in our industry. How many are familiar with shift left or heard of the concept of shift left, right? So I see a hand there. So the concept of shift left is, instead of trying to make security happen after the fact. You try to make security near real time, continuous and complete at the beginning of your journey, right? Embedded in your CI/CD pipeline, right? So you security, try to make security real time and continuous. You have all these tools that are gathering all this evidence. You open up tickets in ServiceNow and Jira automatically, right? As opposed to waiting for something to happen and then addressing it. So the question is, well, we're still doing, all of this in Word and Excel, PowerPoint, and this. So how do you shift left compliance and make it like security near real time and continuous and complete? So first step on this journey is you got to digitize those compliance artifacts and get them into a system of record, right? So you've got to get them into a digital object or digital form first. So RegScale as an example, take those Word docs, Excel spreadsheets, put them into a standard that you can then work with. So putting them into like a NIST standard or a tool that can support that standard, that's kind of the first step, right? Second step is the tools are always changing. So you need to integrate with the tools that you are already looking at, right? Your cloud security posture management tools of the world, your phone scanners, right? Automatically. Take those findings as mapped to those compliance controls. Automate the creation of tickets in your ticketing systems. Push a button, push audit-ready documentation on demand, right? So you should have a really good machine experience for that machine-to-machine communication. And you should have a really good human experience to manually document your evidence and controls and manually test the things that would take a human to do. Pull those both together to keep your evidence and artifacts continuously up to date, right? And then you should be able to, we talked about the CCM, Cloud Controls Matrix, right? How do you assess that, take that information you gathered and use it across multiple standards and frameworks? So using mapping frameworks like CCM, there are other ones out there, right? To use them, reuse that evidence across multiple standards and framework, tailored to your own unique needs, right? And then last, this should work in your environment, right? So this should work in your environment, right? Running in your organization, in your AWS, Azure, GCP environment, right? And be able to use business intelligence to visualize that information in your real time. So this is a way to shift left both security and compliance and bridge the gap between those disciplines. So in conclusion, right? Compliance is hard. Period, full stop, it's hard, right? The way to do it manually, it's tedious, right? It's out of date the moment you create it, right? Doing it across multiple standards and frameworks makes it even more so complex, right? When you have to do it across multiple geographies, right? You just got to hire, and it's really hard to bring on people just to do this. So standards and tools can help. So we talked about CCM plus the cake, free tool, CSA offers that. So an industry accepted mapping created by industry, supported by industry, that's one option. NIST RegScale, another way to kind of have this machine readable and human readable language to automate security assessments. And you've got to have a way to pull all those together. So free tools exist. My day job, we actually have a completely free tool that does and takes all this and brings it to life. Completely free community edition. So you can download that and use it for free. But there are other tools that exist on the market today that make this, everything we kind of talked about, possible, right? But the reality is every journey like this begins with a simple step. You have to be able to take a step where you're employing automation, right, to keep your artifacts up to date. You're reusing assessment information, and you're rethinking compliance. We're not doing the same thing over and over again. So with that, hopefully I gave you a couple things to think about. Happy to take any questions.
You're way out of time. So we got a little bit of time. We've got some questions for Anil.
So you mentioned the word RMF.
Yes, great question.
Not sure that's a word.
Yes, risk management framework. Good question. Excellent question. So, and you're right. I should have said that because you should be able to, and by leveraging this and positing this definition, automate all the steps of the RMF. And that's what this is intended to do. Is the RMF is a kind of manual, kind of paper-based. There's a lot of things that define your controls, implement your controls, monitor your controls, right? So DoD CIO put out a memo back in March around what it takes to get a continuous authorization to operate, right? So, and in there he talked about the fact that you need to be able to continuously monitor your controls in near real time, right? So if you look at that memo dated in March, and then you look at this definition of RegOps and the principles, you should be able to see some similarities and the free standards that exist to make some of that real. But really the intent is to automate the RMF and make this activity a near real-time activity. So it's not a paper-based one-time activity, but you're outputting audit-ready documentation automated.
So pulling the thread on that question a little bit, so there's that magic CCM matrix. Is there an alignment of that CCM as it relates to RMF, or are those orthogonal?
Yeah, orthogonal. RMF is more a framework of how you do it as opposed to a standard, like a list of controls, right? So it's not a control library of here are the controls. CCM is a, here's the CCM controls mapped to.
More like the list of your NIST controls for 100.
Yeah.
Based on 800.
Yeah.
That's like 1100.
Yep.
And the problem is I keep seeing a lot of mappings over time, right? The original CMMC was RMF. It was based on like the subset of 800 between the 171 controls. Then they started adding controls from all these different countries together. And you have the CSA thing, CSA vulnerability. So one of the guys who actually developed a lot of the RMF about 8 years. Benefit that is it's very complicated. And then there are an enormous number of tools that vector things, right? But not many of them deal with the organizational. They have to focus on system controls because that's all they know about.
Yep.
But yet people don't have the organization. So you don't have a rule that says you can't write your PIN on your smart card.
Yeah.
Documentation and so forth. So this is a bear.
It is a bear. So I'm going to give you a real world example of, one thing that was done historically manual that you have to do, right, for a specific control. We'll use to say a SOC control, right? User provision deprovisioning, right? In large complex organizations, this is a really tough problem, right? When a person leaves an organization, how do you ensure that they have been effectively deprovisioned and all of their access has been removed to all of their requisite systems, right? To meet a SOX control and a NIST control, so on and so forth, right? So I'll tell you the way it's done manually. You log into either AD or Okta. You go pull down the list, here's the spreadsheet of all the different users this month. Next month, you go into the same AD or Okta, and you pull down another spreadsheet, and a human goes and compares the two for diffs. Okay, so that's the manual way. That's how it's done right now. Okay, now let's employ the principles of RegOps and this kind of concept here. So one of the things you can do is you can pull it down, automate the pull down of that spreadsheet monthly, do a diff, save the diff as an assessment to that control, automatically open up a ticket to a compliance professional and say, go review this diff and see if there's any security significant findings in the diff. How many hours did you just save for one control, as an example?
Have you ever seen one of these tools that will like do a scan? Let's say you do a scan of your system and automatically pushes tickets into Jira. End up with 16,000 tickets in Jira.
Yeah.
Yes. So ticket fatigue is a real thing,
Yes.
right? Because there's so alert fatigue, ticket fatigue is a real thing. You need a way to normalize your alerts to then say which ones matter, which ones don't, right? Because it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in security or compliance, it's a thing, right? So you need a way to normalize all of these alerts in A. B, how do you then take those alerts and say, okay, which ones of these alerts are actually showing you a systemic problem, right? So normalizing plus identifying systemic problems, those are things that tools can help you do.
Well, that's where standards, if you get to normalizing or the language or the components of those alerts, the only way you're gonna start getting to that automatic, what's really important is if the tools can find common things and actually do some analytics or, people call it AI, but it's just fancy analytics of trends and issues.
Right. Exactly.
I use models for that from both sides.
Mhm.
The end product part is for RMS specifically, the customers that need the documents they have to generate for RMS practice. So that, well, we use models,
Mhm.
right? And then then we have our standard, policy scripted documents or Excel spreadsheets, a lot of them are easy Excels. And then we go to the customer and say, just hit this
Yeah.
and pop it out. But from the front side of it, we take the 153 other standards and type them in as requirements.
Yeah.
And then you can generate your reports to show how compliant is your model, how
Yep.
accurate is your model, and we
Yep.
put a whole model governance
Mhm.
over top of that to show you that in the organization, you've got the problem is the government doesn't want to pay for the right way to do it. They want the quick and dirty, get the model out there because we're going to be at school.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's getting them to understand that front end is really, really important.
It is.
It's hard.
Yeah, so what you described is a very elegant way to do it, right? So and it's really nice in that you have a nice model to represent it, right? But what we found, a lot of folks to your point is like, government is very comfortable with the paper,
Yes.
right? Like, show me that you create the system security plan that looks like this, right? So what you described is elegant, and it's the way we should be thinking about the problem. But how do you meet them where they are?
That's what we try to generate. Like we're modeling security classifications. But once we get in the model, then they don't have to, you have to write them.
Yeah.
You can print it out as many times as you want, kill all the trees in the world, fine. But get the automated. What we can't get them is to do the front end. Before we go to model, we need to make sure we've got two models.
Yes.
Through the question of the model. And that's where the classification is.
Exactly. So, a lot of this is, and I bring up the concept of RegOps because it's a cultural transformation,
Yeah.
right? You have to transform the culture of how this is done for this to happen. This happened in DevOps, right? So if you go back 10 years, DevOps wasn't a thing. Didn't exist. There was no such concept. But it took a cultural transformation coupled with tooling for DevOps and DevSecOps and all of us to be sitting in this room for that to happen. So what I'm positing is like, look, let's take those principles, let's go apply them to compliance, and let's do the same thing for that.
So 20 years.
Right. Exactly.
At our retirement ceremony. Yes, we made progress.
Right. But it's going to take, I think, I'm talking about this here because you need a standards body to create a standard around this. There is no standard for this, right? So I'm putting it out there as a conversation. There should be a standard for this. There isn't one. Should probably create one.
You go the RSC route.
Yeah.
So cultural is actually a great lead into the question. One of the biggest barriers that I've seen in practice for shifting left is the way that project management is typically done, getting people to understand the value of shifting left.
Yes.
Because you're spending upfront time, and a lot of times that's going to push capability to the right while you're building in all of the systems. So what strategies have you used to start those conversations and get everybody on board with that idea?
Yeah. So, ultimately, you have to find a way to save people time. This is the one thing you cannot recreate, right? Yeah. So if you can find a way to demonstrate how you are going to save somebody time by implementing this approach, right? Whether it's reducing alert fatigue, whether it's minimizing cost, right? To then reapply activity dollars to go do something that adds more value to the business, whether it's deploying applications faster and more securely, right? Leveraging those business outcomes to say, this is why you want to make this investment. That's how you drive that change.
You know any research that you commonly cite that can demonstrate some of those things with hard numbers?
Yeah, it's tough. It depends, yeah. It's tough. Yeah, but the honest answer is it's tough because it depends on the business, right? Every business is different and everyone's gonna say, well, that's not me. Show me what that means for.
Right, my business, right?
In my business, we do this. So the answer is it's tough, right? Yeah, but what you have to do is demonstrate it in small, real, tangible ways. So you're hitting the elephant all at once. You got to do it in bite-sized chunks, right? Show small, meaningful, tangible improvements.